No, Victorian era fashion is not what you think. Got him! What is happening on my head today? Because this is not under my control. The reason I'm making this video is A, because the 1920s video I did turned out to be illuminating? Since some stuff is apparently not so obvious to many of you, I thought maybe some of you might need like a precise explanation of what Victorian era fashion is, mainly because of all the stereotypes like flying around and also because of the media not really getting what Victorian era fashion is and portraying it as something else. I'm not gonna do a roleplay this time because you guys absolutely hated it. One of the reasons I'm making this video now is because one of you sent me an article by Vogue, which I guess would pass as a sort of fashion history authority, and the article or the post or whatever the hell that is called "Modern Victorian Updos Are Taking Over Instagram. Here is how to do them right." So obviously I got really excited. I was like, yay for fashion history influences on modern fashion, right? But then I saw the article and I was like, that shit ain't Victorian, girl. That's Edwardian. That's like the essence of Edwardian look. Basically all those hairstyles are A, pretty modern, but B, they're just really Edwardian. And I was thinking, if even Vogue does not get it right, how would people actually understand what Victorian fashion was? Let me clarify this.
Let me clarify this. Thank you for having me.
First of all, it's pretty much about the time. So Victorian era was almost a century long. It's not like you could say, oh, I'm gonna dress up in a 20th century style. It's basically almost a century. So saying that something is Victorian style is a really wide way to describe things. 19th century was so diverse in terms of like silhouettes, styles, cuts, patterns, you know, everything, undergarments, hairstyles. It just, every season there were new and new looks that the designers came up with, and they changed so often. It's sometimes really incredible to like compare looks from, let's say, 10 years apart, because nowadays you wouldn't see anyone running in a crinoline and then 5 years later you would have a bustle like that. Those changes were huge. So saying that something is Victorian is a really vague way to describe things. Basically, Queen Victoria became queen in 1837, which was kind of in the middle of the Romantic era. It was a little bit past the like really huge sleeves, elaborate decoration, girls looking like dolls basically. Honestly, if you look at the fashion plates, there's just so much going on, you know, all sorts of frills, decoration, laces, bows, flowers, like anything feminine is in it. But when Queen Victoria became a ruler, she was like pretty much into this more simple and somber style of clothing, which does not mean that the whole Victorian era was like that, because obviously you have to remember that Victorian fashion obviously applies to probably mostly British fashion at the time. The French fashion kind of went its own way, even though the silhouettes were pretty much the same, but it's mostly down to the color palettes or the decoration and etc. So if we're talking about Victorian fashion as in Victorian fashion, like fashion that was happening during the Victorian times but in the Victorian Great Britain, then let's say it started to get a little simpler once Queen Victoria became queen. So the fashion was really like influenced by her, by other monarchs, by other like royals, but at the same time that does not mean that it just stayed flat for like a whole century almost and that nothing changed. So Queen Victoria ruled until 1901, which is when she died, and which is also when Victorian era fashion kind of stopped, because that's a beginning of another era. Like, you wouldn't call it Victorian because there was no Victoria anymore. What we're referring to as Victorian fashion today is heavily influenced by the early 20th century fashion, which is basically like 1900 to 1901. So we're basically trying to sum up almost a whole century of fashion through those last 2 years of the era. So what you're thinking when Victorian comes up is often like the puffy updos, the high collars, black frills, long skirts and like sort of blouses, I would say, because I've noticed that a lot. This is actually Edwardian. Like, this is pretty much the last breaths of the Victorian era, so this was pretty much already in the 20th century. And while technically it is still Victorian, it does not sum up well what had happened in the 70 years before that, which is what kind of bugs me, because, you know, there's a lot of like Victorian style things going around, and it's almost always these like really heavily Edwardian influenced things, and I'm like, that ain't Victorian, girl! So what was Victorian style then? Can you say that something is Victorian style? It would be really hard, honestly, because like almost every decade something different happened, something else happened. If we look at the Victorian era like as a whole, it will be really difficult to sum up what was going on, especially that it happened during the Industrial Revolution, and a lot of the things in like the way that clothes are made, the fabrics used, you know, a lot of that changed during that time. So it's sort of like a revolution in itself. It will be really hard to like pick one style that summarizes it. What I've noticed though is people mostly see Victorian clothing as in the second part of the 19th century, which is why is it so bright all of a sudden? What is going on? Which is really tight bodices and then flowing skirts with no sort of support undergarments. So that would be sort of like 1890s, which is pretty much the last decade. What I used to think Victorian style meant, to me it kind of always was second bustle era, which is like 1880s, later 1880s, because of the bustle and because of the high collars and the way it was sort of tied and the brownish, you know, desaturated sort of colors. To me, it was like the epitome of Victorian era fashion, mostly though because I really enjoyed Sherlock Holmes, and it kind of was like almost in that era, so I was like, oh, that's Victorian. Then some of the people I know, when you say Victorian, they see crinolines, and that's also correct, because that happened in 1850s/1860s, and it was also a very like distinct look that's really easy to connect with particular time, and for some people this screams Victorian, and they're also correct. Later, when I was really into Jane Eyre and I started sort of digging into 1840s fashion, I thought 1840s really screams Victorian to me, because it's really strict and it's really like somber and kind of very and technically that would also be right. So it's really difficult to summarize Victorian era fashion, especially that it sort of went like this. It was like, let's say we have the frilly, crazy 1830s, then we have the more somber fashions of the 1840s, though this probably only applies to the day fashions, because in the evening everyone went crazy anyway. But we have, let's say, a more earthy color palette, a really like narrow cuts, like no fabric is wasted, it's all pretty much set. We have a limited amount of accessories, because 1830s were all about the crazy accessories, and in 1840s it's sort of like toned down. But then in 1850s the fashion was very much French inspired, thanks to Empress Eugenie, which was sort of 18th century inspired aesthetic, where you had tons of flowers, pastel colors. It sort of became a little bit more feminine and delicate again. There was a lot of plaid involved, but there was also a lot of like frills. Basically there was a lot more going on than in 1840s, but then again in 1860s it sort of went straight into this control, like geometrical design, which was also often like the color palette was sort of toned down. You would have, for example, like a brown dress with black decoration or trimming. Around 1856 the crinoline appeared, so let's say the late 1850s and the 1860s was a sort of era where the skirts would get really like voluminous. But then in 1870s, there we go again, like flowers, frills, 18th century inspirations. That's where the first bustle appears. It's basically like the crinoline just sort of started tuning into this like oval shape, and then you had the huge support at the back. The bodices got a bit higher, probably the highest they were since the 1830s, and basically again we have a lot of feminine sort of decoration, pastel color combinations and all of that. Then we have the 1880s, which started off by this sort of transitional period where you would ditch the bustle altogether and then it would sort of come back. It's really complicated. See how many changes there are within like, let's say, 4 years of fashion. Like, it must have been working really hard to sort of stay fashionable at the time, having to have all these clothes like remade and retrimmed and stuff like that, which was actually often the case. Like, you wouldn't buy a new dress, you would just sort of redo a dress that you already have, so it's not like really behind the fashion. So then 1880s were sort of this, again, a little bit more strict silhouette, where there were a lot of like asymmetrical cuts patterns. The color palette changed a bit, decoration changed, like there was a lot of trimming that was done with the same fabric that was used for the dress itself. There was a lot of like geometrical sort of inserts and stuff like that. What's going on? But then we have 1890s where we sort of lose the bustle altogether, but instead we get those huge sleeves, so like gradually the sleeves would get really big. Then we have a color palette that's kind of all over the place, because you would get the pastel colors, but then you would also get the more toned down earthy like jewel tones, and it's really sort of flowy, and it's really hard to just pick one silhouette that the Victorian era fashion is. So in conclusion, there is no such thing as Victorian era fashion. If you wanted to sum it up properly, you probably have to talk about all these changes. So another thing that is really interesting is when you say Victorian, you think corsets. I don't know where the trend of like wearing the corsets on the outside came from. That was not really a thing during the Victorian era. Like, you would have a couple of garments that sort of resembled corsets that were worn, let's say, in 1860s, for example, and then in 1890s, but those were mostly boned belts, really. Their purpose was not to make the waist smaller. When it comes to corsets, it's kind of funny, because up until 1860s, most of the corsets would not actually feature any sort of really stiff boning. 1830s, 1840s, 1850s, most of the corsets would be stiffened with cord or like whale boning, but only in a couple of places, just so the stay stiff. But honestly, they were not that strict. They were basically brass. Lately I've examined an 1850s corset in a museum, and it basically had like a full-on modern cup, so that could not have been that uncomfortable. Just having a layer of clothing here and there. It was not laced really tight, because you would not need that. Like, that was not really a thing back then. True, it was considered improper if you were not wearing a corset or a stays. That's because it sort of showed, like you would see the saggy boobs and everything. Nowadays, if you go on a formal occasion and you're not wearing a bra, like someone might notice that as well. In modern world, it's sort of not considered the most appropriate thing to do in formal occasions. So that was sort of what happened back then. You could basically tell when someone was not wearing stays or a corset. Up until like 1850s, 1860s, the corsets were not really made to make your waist smaller. They were sort of supposed to be the support bodice that you have underneath your actual bodice, so the whole dress looks nice. Tight lacing was not really a thing up until the later part of the century, but even then it was considered immodest, it was considered shallow, and there was probably a really small percentage of women that actually did tight lacing, especially that you could really easily get away with just padding the right parts of your bodice to make the waist to hips ratio seem bigger. Obviously, when we think corsets, the first thing that comes to our mind is Victorian again, but most of the time the corsets were just sort of a bra type of garment that was supposed to help you keep your boobs in place and basically smooth out the bodice of the dress. But you know, the goal of wearing a corset was not to die. There are a couple of videos on corsets already, like I don't need to tell you that. Bernadette Banner recently posted a video on that particular matter, so you can check it out. I posted a video about how women's waists were actually a lot of the time it was optical illusion, so just go check those videos out. Not gonna delve into that, but it was not as simple of, you know, torturing women for the sake of beauty and male gaze nonsense. No. When you look at the undergarments of the 19th century, they are always practical. Every layer is there to do something. Every piece of clothing that you put on, even though there was a lot of layers involved, they sort of had a purpose. Like, they wouldn't just come up with a layer for no reason. Maybe the solutions were not always the greatest, but they were thought through. Oh my god. Another thing is that we often forget that back in the day, back in the 19th century and early 20th century, you would basically have a different garment, a different type of garment, a different cut of garment different for every activity during the day. Obviously that only applies to like the really high class and the rich people, but you would basically have different garments, different types of garments for everything you do. So you would have either a morning gown or a peignoir. You would have a tea gown for the afternoon when you're receiving guests at your place. You would have sports clothing that looked completely different from what you wore every day, especially when it comes to like bathing suits later in the century, like bicycle outfits. They were so different from what you would wear every day. You would have sport corsets, which were lightly boned and did not affect like your mobility at all, but helped you, you know, retain the fashionable shape and silhouette. You would have evening gowns, which is something I think a lot of people forget nowadays, is that back then, you know, whatever you wore during the day did not apply to what you would wear in the evening. There was the whole philosophy of wearing like different type of gowns for the opera, different type of gowns for concerts, different type of gowns for balls, evenings, dinners. If you were rich enough, you would probably have a different gown for everything you do. That's why it's so hard to summarize Victorian fashion, because what do you mean? Like, do you mean the morning gowns? Do you mean like what you would wear for a walk in the city, or do you mean the evening gowns where, you know, you would have a bare shoulder look that was not allowed during the day? That's why it's so difficult, and that's why this video is pointless, because I'm not telling you what Victorian era fashion is, I'm telling you everything that it's not, basically. But just to let you know, just to sort of show you that there were so many things going on. Another thing is, a lot of modern Victorian style things are sort of really dark and grimy and death related. And I'm kind of like, well, I know a lot of people died during that time, but it's just happened in 18th century and 17th century just as much. It was a norm to lose a couple of children during your lifetime. It was like not something really unusual, but that does not mean they all wore black all the time. Obviously it must have affected the frequency of being in mourning, which is something I mentioned in another of my videos. I can't remember which one though. So maybe that's where the perception comes from, I think. A lot of photos and fashion plates of mourning dresses and mourning gowns, which were obviously quite popular at the time because it so happened that a couple of times during your lifetime you would have to be in mourning. Maybe that's why we tend to think it was all really memento mori sort of thing. Everyone was just wearing skulls and black frills all the time, whereas it only applied to the small number of people, because obviously not everyone wore mourning all the time. And I think it's also because of Queen Victoria's outfits, which obviously after the death of Prince Albert, she started wearing black mourning clothes and she just stayed that way until the end of her life. And I think that's when sort of this stereotype was born, that Victorians were all really like dark and macabre and death inspired. Whereas if you look at the actual Victorian fashion plates and gowns that remained from the era, there was a lot of colors involved, there was a lot of flowers involved, there was a lot of frills, things that you would not say are serious or somber or any type of mourning death related. So you had this one side of life, which was obviously not a very fun one, but then you also had fashion, and fashion usually does not care about what's going on in your life. It just goes on and it stays alive and it changes and it evolves. So you had, really honestly, you had a lot of pink involved, you had a lot of floral patterns, you had a lot of really strange patterns in 1830s and 40s. Like if you look at the fabric samples from the era, damn, that crap is weird. You have a lot of Barbie pink tones, you have a lot of zigzags, you have a lot of lighting bulbs. Some stuff is really crazy and you would never say it's, let's say, 1840s, but it so happens it was, and probably a lot of women wore stuff like that because it was fashionable. It's funny how we nowadays, if you say Victorian, we tend to focus on this more dark side of the Victorian era, which, to be honest, it applies more to the lower class outfits and dresses and fashion, because obviously they didn't have the means and they didn't have the surroundings to keep their clothes clean and fresh and colorful all the time. So actually I think if we manage to see what the Victorian lower class clothes look like in real life, because nowadays it's mostly photographs that still exist, but I think if we manage to see them in color, we would be actually surprised at how much closer they are and they were to this Victorian stereotype that we have nowadays. Another thing is the hair. So as I mentioned in the beginning of the video, usually when we think of Victorian hair, we see the Edwardian like Gibson girl hairstyle, which obviously is not a good description of what Victorian era hair was. The Gibson girl hairstyle trend from like the second half of the 1890s, so it obviously is just the very last bit of the Victorian era. But when you look at all of the hairstyles and hair in the Victorian era, the thing they have in common is really long hair. It was a norm to have hair reaching to your ankles or knees. It made the hairstyles really much easier, but it was also considered very feminine, and basically cutting your hair really short was a sign of sickness. So you actually do see photos like this from time to time where women have really short hair, and you can tell it's probably because they were really sick at the time, or they just recovered from a sickness, but basically you would have really long hair. But it's a topic for another video. But I think it's good to know that the hairstyles back then were really complicated, they were really complex. They were usually, if you were rich enough, they would have been done by a maid, which is what allowed them to be so like intricate. I think the most complicated hairstyles, hair designs that I've seen were 1870s, where you had a lot of curly hair pieces, you know, hair rats. It was basically 18th century inspired, so there was a lot going on. The more simplistic designs were, I think, 1850s, 1860s and 1840s. The later half of the century had a trend that is not really nowadays considered Victorian, which was really short bangs. So basically if you look at the photos of women from 1870s to the end of the century, the vast majority of them would have those really awkward bangs that are really curly, and basically they do not look good on everyone. But that was a thing, that was a really common trend, and it was actually more unusual to wear your hair without the front bangs. So this is something we don't really consider Victorian nowadays, even though it was a thing for almost half of the era, which is really interesting, I think. And it's also something we tend to forget when we dress up as Victorians, and I think it really adds this nice little touch, especially to 1880s, which was sort of the renaissance of the awkward bangs. Anyway, I think these are all the misconceptions that I wanted to talk about. If there's anything else that bugs you about people not getting the Victorian era fashion right, let me know in the comments, because I'm really interested in what people that are not into fashion history think and what they see as Victorian. Yeah. Bye. I forgot to say bye. Bye.